Hey everyone, my name is Alexandra and I'm a watercolor artist. Today I want to talk to you guys specifically about watercolor paper, even more specifically about hot press versus cold press paper. A lot of you guys know if you've started painting with watercolor, there's so many different things to look at, so many different supplies, and one of the biggest questions people have for me is, what is the difference? What do you prefer? And when should you use each different type of paper? So in today's video, I'm going to answer all of these questions for you guys. I'm using Strathmore's Ready Cut watercolor paper. There's a few things to look for when you guys are choosing the watercolor paper that you're using in your paintings. So I always like to make sure that mine's 100% cotton. For the weight of the paper, you want it to be 140 pounds or more. And the GSM, which is grams per square meter, you're looking for 300 or more. So those are just the basic things when I'm picking my paper to paint with that I'm looking for. For this tutorial, I'm using Strathmore Ready Cut watercolor paper for hot press and for cold press. Both of them have the same pounds and GSM, as well as both being 100% cotton. Right, so to show you guys the difference between the papers, we are going to paint same leaf on both paper, and then yeah, we'll just see what the paper does and you guys will get a better idea of how they differ, and then I'll talk more about when I like to use each one. So on the left here, I have our hot press watercolor paper. So the first thing that I want to start with is I'm gonna paint a leaf. I'm gonna do it nice and watery. I'm just gonna add a little bit more color in there. So one thing that I notice right away when I'm using hot press paper is that I find that the lines paint on very smooth. So I'm just gonna add a bit more color to the side here so that we can see how it bleeds into the page. Yeah, so again, you'll notice that because hot press paper is a more smoother texture than cold press, I get very clean lines along the edges of my paper. So now I want to do the exact same thing with my cold press paper, just so that we can see what the difference is. So I'm gonna start with my basic leaf shape. I'm starting with it really light just because I want to bleed color in so that we can see just the difference of how it bleeds in. Add a little bit more paint in there. So honestly, from the beginning, these look very similar. This one is starting to dry. I'm just gonna let the cold press one fully dry, and then I will talk to you about some things to compare. But while that is happening, I want to paint the stem. So I'm just gonna do a really fine line on both paintings. Right, and for this, I can talk about some differences right away. So one thing that I notice with the hot press paper is that the line draws on very smooth. Because hot press is naturally has a smoother finish, it's easier. You find that a lot of artists that use it like it because they get smoother, fine details, whereas you do have to look closely to see. But for the cold press paper, it has a bit more of grainy edges, and that's just because the paper is more textured. The water, yeah, sits on the paper differently than the hot press, where you can see the texture of the paper more so, especially when you're doing fine details. All right, so we'll also talk now about the leaves and what we notice here. So I find that when I'm using hot press paper, the color will bleed more fully into what I'm painting. With cold press, you'll notice that you get a bit more of a textured line. They are looking pretty similar in this one, so I'm just gonna paint a few more leaves so that we can see, yeah, even more clearly what it looks like, and I'm gonna do some more dramatic bleeds in them. All right, so I went in and I painted leaves on both pieces of paper. When you just take a quick look at them, honestly, they look very similar, but if you look more closely, you can kind of see the differences. So I'll show you more specifically with these two leaves. With these bottom ones, I had the paper more wet just because I wanted to see the paint bleed into the page more. So you'll notice with this one, it has a very nice fade and the color will bleed into more of the space where I had the water painted. In the cold press paper, because of the texture of the paper, it sort of makes the watercolor, yeah, the best way to explain it is that the watercolor kind of has a mind of its own and it'll follow the texture of the paper. So instead of seeing this really smooth fade, you see the line where the water decided to go and where the paint decided to go, depending on how wet or how dry it was. So some people don't like this. A lot of people will prefer the very smooth fade with the color into whatever they're painting. For me, for a lot of my paintings, I really like the effect where it sort of blooms into whatever you're painting, right? So I see that there's spots and there's different lines and I can see the edges of the texture. I find that just adds a lot more depth and interest to my painting. So personal preference, I like that cold press does that, but when I use hot press paper, I do love just like the cleanliness, I guess, and the smoothness of the lines and just how the paint goes onto the paper. So again, I'll show you guys with this leaf right above. So this one more specifically, I had my paper not as wet, so it was a little more on the dry side, just because I wanted to get a bit more of that stark difference. And you'll notice here, again, it kind of has a smoother finish when it bleeds into the page, whereas this one, you can see just the different shape and texture as the paint bled into the paper. So super similar, super subtle differences, but that is one thing that you'll notice when you're painting with both types of paper. So specifically for that, honestly, what I would say is get both types of paper, practice, try them out and see what you like. So now I'm just gonna go in and add some fine details on some of the leaves of both of these paintings, and then we'll talk a little bit about that, and then I'll let you know when to use which kind of paper. Okay, so I added some small details just to a few of the leaves, not to all of them, because I want you guys to still be able to see the difference with different techniques that I'm using. But one thing that is harder to see unless you look very closely, but as I'm painting, I do notice that the hot press paper does give me much smoother lines and it is easier to paint. So in general, especially when I'm painting my leaves, I don't necessarily want my leaf lines to be super straight and super, I like them to have a bit more rough edges. So on both the hot press and cold press, I tried to stick to the same style. But you do find that, especially with the fine details, it's much easier to do those very dainty, delicate lines. So for our hot press paper, one of the main reasons that people will prefer it is, especially if they're scanning and reproducing for illustration, hot press paper tends to scan and digitize a lot easier because it doesn't have the texture. You'll notice that it's a lot easier to remove that white space and not have you see the grainy texture of the paper in your scans. Whereas cold press paper, when you're scanning it in, often you can see the texture of the paper and it takes a bit more work if you're wanting to remove that. For a lot of paintings that I do, I actually like to be able to see the texture of the watercolor paper, and I like for it to look like it's on watercolor paper. So I do prefer cold press paper, but they yeah, they both have good uses. So if you're doing a lot of things like digitizing and illustration, then I would definitely recommend hot press paper. Yeah, and then honestly, in general, it comes down to personal preference. So I prefer cold press paper. I've been working with it more. I find that I like the control I have when I'm trying to bleed different colors into each other. And when I'm adding fine details, I don't mind that it can look a little bit more grainy. So in general, I do prefer cold press paper. I find that if you're a beginner, it's a good one to start with. Hot press takes a bit more practice to get control of, learn how the water works with the paper, because the water doesn't necessarily bleed into the paper as much as with cold press does. Cold press tends to soak in more water just because of the texture. So those are a few major differences. Hot press paper, another reason that people use it is if they're using mixed media. So it is easier if you're using, say, watercolor and ink, because your pen lines will draw on a lot smoother. Again, I still use cold press when I'm doing watercolor and ink together. It just depends on how you like it to look. But that is one of the other reasons that people will choose hot press over cold press. So as you guys may have noticed through this video, I definitely have a preference for cold press paper, but for you guys, try them both, see what you like. They both have benefits in different ways, and honestly the easiest way to see that is to just play around with them, try painting the same thing on both pieces of paper and see what you like better. I lean towards cold press, but I do enjoy using hot press, especially when I'm looking to do super fine details and things like that. So challenge yourself, use them both. Let me know which one you guys prefer in the comments. Thanks for watching. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you haven't already, make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and if you guys do follow along with any of my videos, make sure to follow me on Instagram at Alexandra Victoria Studio and share what you've painted. I'd love to see what you guys are doing. See you next time.